Thanks very much for the invitation to be here today. As you can tell by my resume, the archaeology of Chinese railroad workers is actually a real recent part of my research efforts, and I have to admit there's a lot I need to learn. She has already helped out with translation of some of the characters on some of the bowls and stuff, so there's lots of stuff that I admit I have to learn about the archaeology of Chinese railroad workers. But it's really exciting, and especially as researchers, as you know, it's always fun to learn new things, and so it's not only understanding the history of China, why people immigrated to the United States, but also a whole new class of artifacts to learn, and material culture, and which is always fun. So what I did is I brought some artifacts that we have that are associated with Chinese railroad workers. So some of the bowls, teacups, different things. These are little medicine jars, and also some. I don't have an extensive library, but I bought a few books along for folks if they want to look at or put on their list of reading or Christmas gifts. So the archaeology of overseas Chinese, and particularly those employed in the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, has recently become an important subgenre within historical archaeology, most notably led by a research group at Stanford University, and in particular Barbara Voss has been kind of at the forefront of the archaeology of overseas railroad workers. It has also become important at a national scale since we are coming up on the sesquicentennial of the driving of the Golden Spike and the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. What's interesting, I think, is the effort that the Chinese railroad workers put into the construction of the overseas Transcontinental Railroad, particularly the Central Pacific Railroad, actually created the economic atmosphere for the United States to become a world economic power. So I don't think at all do I think we diminish the efforts of these people when we don't recognize what their efforts did in the long history of the United States. And one thing that's kind of a funny anecdote that Barbara Voss had told me is that Leland Stanford was the owner of the Central Pacific Railroad. With the money that he earned from the Central Pacific Railroad, he created Stanford University. And as the various faculty members were trying to organize the overseas railroad workers symposiums and stuff that they have every couple years or so, the Stanford University had a hard time coming up with money. And it's like, this university wouldn't be here except for the efforts of the Chinese, so it's just kind of an interesting part of the whole history of that's kind of been lost to us, unfortunately. So prior to this renewed effort, historical archaeology was largely focused on identifying particular site types, developing artifact typologies and chronologies, and basically laying the groundwork for constructing more sophisticated ways to query the archaeological record. So what I'd like to do is just kind of introduce you a little bit to historical archaeology and what we look at, the different types of methods and techniques that we use to try and interpret the archaeological record. For example, can the archaeological record inform us on demographic, sociological, and economic topics such as camp structure, interaction between and among ethnic groups, shifts in access to markets for food and supplies, menu items, food preparation, and healthcare? Today, what I would like to do is provide you with an overview of the work that we've been doing out on the Central Pacific Railroad grade. It's work that I've been working with my colleagues, Molly Cannon, who's the Executive Director of Museum of Anthropology at Utah State University, Mike Polk, who was recently retired from Sagebrush Archaeological Consultants, and Chris Merritt, who's a state archaeologist, who some of you may already know. We've also been working as part of a larger group of scholars, as I mentioned, at Stanford University, and have also been working with Margaret Chi and Max Chan of the Chinese Descendant Group. groups. They created this nonprofit organization to work to help celebrate the 150th anniversary that's coming up. So like I said, our work has been funded by a pass-through grant to the Utah Division of State History from the National Park Service's Underrepresented Community Initiative. And when the Park Service had Centennial a couple years ago, they had a number of grants to study what they identified as underrepresented groups, and a lot of those involved Asian groups, particularly in Utah. Utah got 3 different grants, one for the Chinese Railroad, one to study the Chinese within Salt Lake City, the history of Chinese in Salt Lake City, and I was mostly an architectural survey, and then also looking at the islanders that came and settled, as well as part of the Mormon Church, and settled out in Skull Valley in that area at Yosepa. So those were 3 of the different grants. So a little bit of background on historical archaeology, and what I wanted to do is try and contrast that with what's.
Sorry, turn on the microphone.
Oh, this one's just going there. Sorry.
Yeah, that's right. Could you try?
Is that better? How's that? Can people hear me okay? Sorry, I don't have a really booming voice. So most people are probably more familiar with what has typically been called prehistoric archaeology, but now I think most scholars now refer to it as either pre-contact or pre-colonial archaeology. And in North America, it mainly is dealing with Native American groups. So with pre-contact archaeology, we don't have written records per se to look at. So historical archaeology provides another avenue for us to pursue. So in large part, it's always tended to focus on groups that were not part of the dominant culture. So in the 1960s and 70s, when historical archaeology really started to become part of the mainstream, historical archaeologists focused on slaves, particularly because there was an underrepresented group that really didn't have a voice, and so their story hadn't been told. And again, the Chinese railroad workers fall into that category as well. And the Chinese railroad workers history is interesting too, because based on a number of historical circumstances, one being the Cultural Revolution, and also the San Francisco earthquake, and the destruction by Leland Stanford's wife of all of his personal papers, a lot of the records of the Central Pacific Railroad, and particularly the information that we would like to see about the Chinese railroad workers, has been lost. There is a group of scholars in China right now that are trying to recover and look more closely at historic records in China to see if there's letters or any documents from people that were still in China, and people and men that may have returned to China, to see if those records are there. So that's another big emphasis. But largely, historical archaeology has tried to focus on those particular groups that, to kind of use the cliche, that really didn't have a voice in the larger Euro-American culture. So during the early and middle part of the 19th century, China was undergoing tremendous change, both internally and externally, through a series of natural disasters, including famine, which led to a number of economic problems and unrest, a series of military defeats at the hands of the British, and so it was just increasingly unrest in China. And as part of that, it culminated in what's known as the Taiping Rebellion, or Civil War, which some people estimate left 20 to 70 million people dead and many, many millions more displaced. So just a tremendous upheaval in the Chinese culture. It was under this turmoil that Chinese men, more particularly from the Guangdong province in in southeastern China began seeking employment and other opportunities abroad. And in the United States, capitalists were also seeking cheap labor. So in 1807, the importation of slaves, African slaves, was outlawed. So as our economic abilities expanded, of course, capitalists always tried to minimize their costs. We're looking for cheap labor. The Chinese men that were coming out of Guangdong province provided that source of labor. And the first of the Chinese immigrants came to California probably in the 1840s and started working within the California gold fields. But Chinese had been in the United States prior to that. There's early records of Chinese seamen being in New York City during the Revolutionary War, and then other smaller visitations by Chinese nationalists. But the big influx of Chinese workers came in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. So with the passage of the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862, the impetus to begin organization and construction of the Transcontinental Railroad was underway. However, progress for the Central Pacific Railroad in the Sierra Mountains was difficult. Charles Crocker, the chief engineer, was unable to keep crews. He estimated that he needed 5,000 men, but could barely hire 600. I think a lot of the crews were abandoning the railroad at a rate of 3 out of every 5. I think, the work was hard, the pay wasn't all that great. They saw opportunities in the gold and silver mines in California and Nevada, so I think a lot of people were abandoning working on the railroad to seek fortunes other places. Desperate to keep on schedule, Crocker made the suggestion to his construction supervisor, James Stowbridge, that Chinese men might be able to fill the needed gap in laborers. Stowbridge felt the Chinese were too slight and weak to accomplish this task, but Crocker persisted, enthusiastically reminding him that these same people had built the Great Wall of China. And whether or not that's true or not, but that seems to has become part of the lore of Chinese workers and why Crocker felt strongly about hiring them. And also probably because they could be hired very cheaply. That should not be minimized. So the Chinese immigrants began work in 1865, showing up at railroad work sites in organized gangs with a single headman. Their labor so impressed Crocker, he began recruiting more men in China. So they actually had agents that were going into China and hiring men. They would loan these men in Guangdong province money to come over and work for the passage, and then they would have to pay them back. So that was another interesting part of the economy. So with the passage of the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862, the impetus to begin organization and construction of the Transcontinental Railroad was underway. 2 railroads, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, were formed to bridge the vastness known as the Great American Desert. And some people today disparage that as flyover country. And having lived in Nebraska for 21 years, I take umbrage with that. The Union Pacific set out from Omaha, Nebraska, while the Central Pacific began in Sacramento, finally joining on 10 May 1869 at Promotora Summit, north of the Great Salt Lake. The portion of interest to us lies west of Promotora Summit in Box Elder County, a distance of about 90 miles, and is known as the Promotora Branch. This is the original grade from the Nevada border and the last segment of Central Pacific Railroad. It was eventually replaced in 1904 with the Lucin cutoff that is basically the modern grade that we see today along I-80. Today the grade is preserved and protected by the Bureau of Land Management as an area of critical environmental concern, but is also accessible as a national backcountry byway. I don't know if anybody's driven that yet, but it's fun, and make sure you bring extra tires. Because this last session that we've been out here, we had 8 flat tires in 2 weeks. So. So the Promotora Branch is in the high desert region of rural northern Utah. Even today, the area is far removed from the urban populations of the Wasatch Front, and is still incredibly sparsely populated up there. No significant water sources are present, and water had to be hauled to work sites by train in wooden barrels. Eventually, as the section stations and the towns began to develop, they started bringing water out of the Grouse Creek Mountains and stuff. But basically, that was the only way to get water. Even after completion of the railroad, access to potable water was still an issue. At Terrace, a 12-mile aqueduct was constructed in the 1880s to bring culinary water from Grouse Creek, and numerous efforts to drill wells in 1892 were eventually abandoned. Fuel to power locomotives was typically from coal, but sagebrush was also used, as was wood hauled by a horse-drawn wagon from the Raft River Mountains, a straight-line distance about 17 miles. Temperatures could range from 106 degrees in the summer to minus 28 degrees in winter. And the winter of 1868 to 1869 was a particularly harsh and brutal winter. And those are actual temperatures that I've gotten off of the records, so we know that that's the extremes that it can be up there. In 1868, the number of Chinese workers rose to about 12,000, most directly off the immigrant ships, and comprised at least 80% of the Central Pacific's workforce. During the final push of 1868 to 1869, it is estimated as many as 6,000 workers toiled across northern Utah, which is probably more people than live there right now. The Chinese work crews were organized into groups of 20 supervised by one white foreman. Crew size would often increase as the difficulty and complexity of the construction increased. And one thing that I think we should note that I think becomes important as we try and look at the archaeological record is that these work crews, they're organized, and they're probably organized along some type of familiar line. People knew each other back in Guangdong, and they came and worked. There's a number of different dialects, so they're probably organized within dialects. Those people and those work crews probably stayed together for a very long time along those along the construction. So one of the things that some researchers are looking at is to see if there is some kind of signature in the archaeological record that can be tied to these different subdialects and these different groups, so that some of the more subtle types of things that we might begin to look at in the archaeological record. Initial wages for the Chinese employees was about $27 per month, but later increased to $30 per month and that was after a work stoppage. But they had to pay for their food and board. Irish workers, in contrast, were paid $35 per month with board included. Mostly the Irish workers, but all the Euro-American workers also got transported to the sites by the Central Pacific Railroad. The Chinese had to find their own way to the site. So working conditions were obviously difficult with few machines available, and I think what's really striking about the lower photograph is you can see the number of horse-drawn carts and stuff that were being used to haul dirt away and also bring in fill. So there was a lot of cuts, a lot of fill that was being made. So it was all mostly done by hand labor. As Mike Polk has described, the common tools consisted of picks, shovels, pry bars, horse and mule-drawn carts, and wheelbarrows. And of course, it was supplemented by nitroglycerin and blasting powder for the really fun jobs. Some estimates indicate that 1 to 10 Chinese workers died during railroad construction, about 1.7 deaths per constructed mile. So workers likely lived in canvas tent camps alongside the grade, possibly pitched over dugout features that would have provided additional protection from winds and cold weather. And there might have been some kind of either a little stove or some kind of hearth built into these things. Some of the ones that have been excavated up in Montana in the gold fields have some kind of little heater in them as well too. Each gang had a cook who purchased dry food to be cooked on site, periodically traveling to San Francisco or Sacramento to purchase the food from Chinese vendors. And we think as the railroad moved further to the east, there were smaller towns that developed with Chinese populations, and these Chinese workers then started becoming entrepreneurs, growing vegetables, providing those kinds of foods along the way. So the system kind of established as the railroads moved further east and became more and more established. Foods would have included vegetables and seafoods, and at some camps, live pigs and chickens were kept. This is in sharp contrast to the Irish crews who habitually ate boiled beef and potatoes. Hygiene seems to have been important to the Chinese, who bathed and washed their clothes regularly. Instead of drinking provided water, which seemed to have been a source of illness to many of the Euro-American workers, they drank lukewarm tea that was provided throughout the day, having been boiled in the morning. This may have allowed them to avoid the dysentery that commonly ravaged, like I said, the Euro-American crews. While these descriptions are overly generalized, and I think in some ways are romanticized, they do provide us with important clues that we can start developing testable hypotheses for looking at the archaeological record. Chinese laborers, as I said, performed dangerous and labor-intensive work, and many died or were seriously injured as a result of explosions, cave-ins, and severe and often unpredictable weather. They also faced health risks from ethnic violence and malnutrition. Little is known from historic documents how individuals treated injuries or alleviated pain from their daily physical labor. Lacking access to traditional doctors and herbal stores, workers relied on a system of informal folk medicines. Archaeological remains provide evidence of how these workers applied traditional knowledge while using locally available plants and small animals in teas, so things that they probably knew from China, they were able to use locally. Traditional medicine vials, opium paraphernalia, and faunal remains of exotic animals that were likely used for both nutrition and medicine have been found at archaeological sites. Workers may have also gathered local plants and small animals to use in teas. A better understanding of how these workers provided health care is an important topic of our research. And so over here I brought up part of an opium pipe, and I think, opium was, even though it had some important cultural aspects, it was probably a lot of self-medication that was going on. We find lots of liquor jars out there as well too. These are some of the Chinese herbal medicine vials. One of them we had analyzed and had calamine lotion in it. And then we've got a number of other ones that have some material in the bottom that we're having some chemists look at to see if we can identify what was in them. So the work that we've been doing, obviously, is not the first work that's been done out there, and a number of researchers in the 1980s and 90s have done more some preliminary work out there. In 1980, Annan Raymond and Richard Fike provided the first comprehensive archaeological survey of the original grade. They recorded various branch stations along the 90-mile route and provided an assessment of site condition, noting the effects of decades of erosion as well as the looting that's been going on out there. In addition to producing the BLM published monograph on the results, Jerry Wiley and Richard Fike developed an important taxonomy of Chinese smoking techniques and paraphernalia, which is still an important resource for us. More specific efforts have been focused within the boundaries of Golden Spike National historic site. These included Adrian Anderson's assessment of domestic structures on Promotora Summit, and the more recent overview and assessment conducted by Sagebrush Consultants in the 1990s and early 2000s under the direction of Mike Polk. Polk's work on the archaeology of the Central Pacific Railroad and Chinese work camps continues to be an important source and guide for other researchers. And a lot of this work that Mike and Ann Polk are doing today is all self-funded. Chris Merritt's dissertation research on the Chinese experience in Montana did not end there, and he continues to do research on the Chinese workers of Utah. So when we got this grant to do survey work out there, we were trying to develop a methodology that was efficient, yet we were able to collect a lot of data that we could go back into the lab and continue to analyze through time. And basically, the reason for that was that we could not collect anything off of the grade. So collection of artifacts just wasn't going to happen. So what we did is we started out first by having a survey crew go out and walk at very closely spaced intervals, usually about 5 meters apart. And as we encountered artifacts, we would pin flag them. And once that survey was completed, we went back and documented every one of the artifacts that we identified. We photographed them and we mapped them in place using an RTK unit, which is essentially is that me? A mapping unit that is tied to satellites, so we can get very highly accurate locations on these artifacts. There were a couple artifacts that we did collect. They were gaming pieces, things that were very unusual and we knew would be prized by looters out on the site. So there were a few things that we have collected just for those purposes. So one of the first, when we got the grant from State History, we identified several areas that we wanted to look at. Two of them were section stations that we knew had from Raymond and Fike's work, had Chinese workers there. And also we went to the town of Terrace, which is a much more larger and more complex community out there. But Bovine served as a section station from 1869 to about 1905. In 1869, the facilities include a section house, train car body, Chinese bunk and cookhouse. Bridges and culverts were also within what was defined as a bovine section station. The section station also had a siding that was used for loading and unloading freight, particularly livestock from local ranchers, and that was probably later on after the railroad became established. A census taken in 1880 recorded 2 white foremen and 17 Chinese section hands were in residence. So this is the map that we produced, and we were a little bit biased in the way that we did collect our data, because there's lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of pieces of fragments of metal and tin cans and things like that didn't really have any real diagnostic information that we did, but most of the things that we did map were essentially refuse. So lots of ceramics, lots of tin cans that we could identify, and other artifacts that might be around. And so this is the map that we produced from that. And so what this map is just delineating is ethnic Chinese versus Euro-American made artifacts. And you can see good concentration of Chinese artifacts. Do I have that backwards? And just some of the different types of Chinese artifacts that we were finding out there. So a lot of opium tins in that bottom right. We also recorded and mapped over 47 features. The most common feature type was a depression or pit that are largely confined to the western portion of the site, and also in association with numerous ethnic Chinese artifacts. Our preliminary assessment is that these represent a segregated area for Chinese residences, most likely canvas tents overlying the pit. It was unclear from the surface expressions if any of these associated pits had any fireplaces in them. And a lot of them had been dug into, so they've been heavily impacted by looting. Other features included structural footprints from probably the water tank and freight platform, culverts, a brick path, a bridge, and various other structural remains such as an outhouse. And so I'll talk more about this later, but we think these might all be the dugouts from the earliest part of the construction. So these work crews would come out, have these dugouts, put canvas tents over them, and then eventually the railroad came along and made more formal structures out there. But we think this is the earliest part of the site, and they're just Chinese men working out there. And these are just some of the various features that we found out there. An example of them.
So if we go up there, we can still see that outhouse. We can still see these.
Yeah, yeah, everything. Yeah, that's.
Promontory.
Excuse me.
This is at Promontory.
No, this is out west of Promontory. So Bovine is probably about 20 miles from the Nevada line. So comparing the results of our survey with those of this 1895 Central Pacific map allows us to more fully assess the archaeological record and begin to interpret the similarities and differences, and also the agents that were responsible for these patterns. So you can see in this 1895 map that the Central Pacific Railroad, it shows these different formal structures. So we have the Chinese house here, a cookhouse. I think this was where the water tank was. That was where the car body was. And this is this outhouse feature here. And then another structure was there as well too. And Ambi was the second site that we looked at. It also served as a section station, but a little bit later than Bovine, and was initially established about 1878 and existed until about 1910. The eastern part of the grade was cut through bedded gravel deposits, probably related to Lake Bonneville. And also the station is at the summit of what's known as Red Dome Pass, that made it necessary to use helper locomotives to make the grade. Ambi also had a Y constructed in it in 1900 to turn these newer, heavier locomotives. The Central Pacific Railroad records indicate the presence of a section station, tool house, Chinese bunk, and cookhouse in 1881. So you can see this is the grade that they cut through these deposits here. This is just a view down towards Ambi. This is a really nicely constructed culvert that's out there. So again, this is a map that we produced, and you can again see obvious segregation of a lot of Chinese artifacts on this side of on the west side of the track. This is the Y that they constructed later on, and a lot of the formal structures are up on the east side. And again, this is a range of the artifact types that we found out there. So bamboo, double happiness, opium tin, and what's known as a wintergreen porcelain. So this is a close-up map of the archaeological material that we collected, and also we've got a Central Pacific Railroad map from 1881 that helps us better identify what each one of those features were out there, and can help us in beginning to interpret the archaeological record, and also start thinking about what we can do in the future when we can actually get out there and start digging into these things, because of course archaeologists like to dig. They like to dig and they like to collect stuff. It's kind of painful to go out there and map all this stuff and spend all this time out there and then not be able to bring anything back. We're just kind of materialists in that sense. So Terrace was the third site that we visited, and it served as the Central Pacific Railroad maintenance and repair headquarters for the Salt Lake Division from about 1869 to 1910. Extensive facilities existed to service the railroad, but it also had to support a community that some people have estimated that as many as 1,000 people were living there at one time, but we were having trouble really finding any evidence to support that. But it was pretty extensive, and probably any of you have been out there. It's with the exception of maybe Tremonton, more people were living there than live in Snowville today. So it was a thriving community, as you can see from some of these contemporary photographs. The 1870 census documented 22 Chinese males aged 12 to 55 and one 28-year-old Chinese woman, which and some people have assumed is a prostitute. And even though the assumption is that she's a prostitute, in the census records, she's identified as a waiter in the Mill House, which was a restaurant there. So that's up to interpretation of what actually her role was out there. But to have a woman in northwestern Utah at that time, a Chinese woman, was very, very rare. So extensive remains of the town are still present, and it's listed as a ghost town in Utah, and you can drive out there on the grade. So this is the actual byway that you can drive on. So there's remains of these are the old coal bins out here. These are a bunch of domestic buildings out here. More here. This is where the hotel was. This was the area. There was a roundhouse out here, and also a number of facilities for repairing the railroads. There's lots of coal slag and stuff out in this area. And then this was probably that one building that you saw in that photograph was right here, and then a lot of other materials out this way. For Terrace, since it's such a large and extensive area, we really didn't map every artifact that we found out there. We concentrated only on the Chinese artifacts. So we are somewhat obviously biased in that respect. But these are some of the artifacts that were collected by Raymond and Fike out there. You can see some Euro-American items, also the lid to a liquor jar, probably, and then also that one spouted brownware jar is probably soy sauce. So this is our map of all the Chinese artifacts that we mapped, and specifically the ceramics. So as you can see, once again, the Chinese community is very isolated, and if you could say that there's a bad section of town in such a small town, it's located down by the coal bins, which probably, as windy and dusty as it is out there, probably wasn't the greatest place to live. But it is a pretty extensive a collection of artifacts and a very extensive community that was there at the time. And again, unfortunately, there's been a lot of looting going on out there as well, too. In fact, one of the days that we were out there was a guy out there with a metal detector and shovel collecting on the site.
Where did you say this was located? Did you say by Snowville?
This is a town of Terrace, so it's actually closer to Park Valley.
Oh, Park Valley?
Yeah, and a little bit west of Lucin, or not Lucin, Kelton, a little west of Kelton.
Can you clarify, you talked a couple of times about this double happiness bowl. I don't know what that is. Can you explain what that is?
A double happiness? So it's actually, this is one of them. It's a design on a bowl. So there was different types of ceramics that were being imported, and based on information from store inventories in San Francisco and Los Angeles, we've been able to get value on them, on different types of bowls, and also when they might have been appearing. So there's, and I'll talk a little bit more about the typology later on, but this would be what's known as a double happiness.
So what does that mean?
It's a design on it. Yeah, and the characters of the bowls. This was probably a rice bowl for eating out of. And she was providing me with a lot more information on
One is lucky and double lucky, especially for weddings.
and this is also another example of one as well, too. So we're just looking at different types of bowls, of ceramics, and the type of either glaze, like this one is known as wintergreen, so it's a really fine glaze. It's a much more expensive teacup. It shows up a little bit later. It also, because it's more expensive, it seems like when the workers were later on, as they were accumulating wealth, a little bit more money, they were able to purchase these things. There's another type is this floor flowers design. So they're different types of ceramics that we see out there, and they have different information associated with them that we can use to start interpreting the archaeological record. So again, this is just a kind of a close-up of the Chinese ceramics that we mapped out there. And also a couple of these items that we did collect. One is a Vietnamese zinc dong that was probably used in gambling. There was a lot of coins that show up at sites that probably didn't really have any value per se in the United States, but they were used for gambling and gaming. And also these two gaming pieces that we found out there as well too. And the reason, like I said, we collected these, and they're curated at the Museum of Anthropology in Logan, is because they would disappear. These would be things that collectors like to have, so they would just disappear from the archaeological record and our ability to study them. So one of the topics that we're currently exploring is social and economic patterns out there, and how this is reflected in the material culture, and specifically the ceramics, since that seems to have the best interpretive value for us is ceramics. For example, if we look at these two work camps, so these were two other sites that we recorded. They're a little bit off of the grade. They probably represent very short-term camps that workers came in early on. There was no formal structures there. yeah, they were just a very early camp for with workers that were associated with some of the early phases of laying out the grade. The ceramic assemblage is represented almost exclusively by the least expensive ceramics, and it has the least diversity of ceramics. So things like bamboo style, which I don't have a sample of that over there. The bamboo and also the double happiness seem to be some of the least expensive of those. The temporal pattern is a little bit less unclear, but Sando and Felton did an inventory of a Chinese store in California that indicated that double happiness had the highest frequency prior to 1870, and then bamboo replaced that in frequency after 1870. So these work camps probably were about somewhere around 1869. So somewhere in that the cusp of that divide. That's why we probably see them almost. Those numbers that kind of reflect that temporal pattern. And again, when we talk about temporal patterns, we're talking about really short time periods. And there's lots of different things that could affect the availability of those ceramics coming in. It might not only have been the choices people were making when they purchased those things, but what was being shipped, what was available. There was one cartel that was controlling all the importation of ceramics, so they were controlling the flow out of China and into the United States. So there's lots of different economic agents that were operating on the availability of these ceramics to these workers. And also whether or not they were getting paid on time. I think that probably is an important aspect of it. What's kind of interesting is that it's at least an archaeologist, is that the pattern is really similar to a similar work camp of the Southern Pacific Railroad down in Texas, even though it's a little bit later in time. And there's a historian, Choi, who's written a very good, nice paper on ceramics and the value of ceramics, what they mean, and also the social patterns and eating patterns associated with the overseas Chinese. And he defines the pattern that we think we see at these worker camps as represented by single male workers, as we would expect. Each of those workers had their own bowl, and sometimes those bowls were distinguished by a name or a mark, and the meals were served out of this common bowl. So we'd have one person that was acting as cook have a single bowl of food, and people would just eat out of that communal bowl. At Bovine, there's a pretty clear association of some of the earliest and least expensive ceramics with the dugout. So again, those would have represented the earliest part of the site. These were single male workers coming out and working out of these dugouts prior to the railroad coming along and creating these the more formal structures that are out there. And I think we have a pretty nice association with that pattern. At Ambi, which again is a later section station than Bovine, and this is reflected in the assemblage with bamboo being more frequent type than a double happiness. The assemblage is more diverse. We start seeing the four seasons. Flowers start being present there, and again, that may represent one thing being later in time, but also a little bit more accumulation of wealth, and I think availability is an important part of the story here too. What's becoming available to these workers. The assemblage also is much larger than that we see at Bovine, even though it's a little bit shorter in its time span. But probably by the turn of the the 20th century, the Chinese workers were no longer there and had probably moved on. At least that's what we're starting to see in the census records. And we also see a fairly large assemblage of brown glazed ware. So this is an example of one of these glazeware vessels. It came over. It probably was wax sealed and had a cork on it, and had a lot of different types of foods would come in these. Smaller ones would have sauces in them as well. But it's interesting that at Bovine or at Ambi, we're starting to see a lot more of those than we did at Bovine. So the ceramic assemblage at Terrace it includes a much higher frequency of expensive tableware. And when we talk about expensive tableware, we're talking about what's known as the wintergreen, and also some of the other types. The functional differences may also be apparent, particularly in comparing assemblages from such disparate sites, which has a much varied population and economy. So the more when we compare it to the more demographically and probably economically limited section stations. Oh, that's okay. So again, this is, what we're looking at here is, the frequency of these different types. So we started to see Four Seasons, and also the wintergreen are showing up in much higher frequencies. And also what we're starting to see is a much more diverse assemblage. So lots of different types of bowls, sizes of bowls. We're also starting to see items such as these spoons out there, which we didn't see at these other at the section stations. So what we're starting to see here, I think, is what Choi refers to as a family-type setting. Food was served in a communal style, and each person had an individual rice bowl. A range of serving vessel shapes and sizes were present to accommodate different foods placed at the center of the table. We also, at Terrace, we're starting to see a diversity in these foods as represented by, we've got this pig skull, and also on the bottom we've got these butchered cattle bones. And we didn't see those at any of that particular types of foods at any of the section stations. The assemblage at Terrace is very similar to that which we see in a Los Angeles Chinatown. And what we're also likely seeing is not only an increase in economic status of the Chinese at Terrace, because we know that they were not only working for the railroad, but they were also becoming entrepreneurs at this time. They're owning businesses. But they're also, and this is something, is that there's a sense of stability that's being felt, I think, at the community. As people become more comfortable in their social status, they're more willing to invest in expensive items. But again, this is an idea that's out there that we need to more fully explore, because at that time, the railroad was going strong. There was a lot of employment, and there was also a reason to start supporting these communities. And so at a lot of these different railroad towns in Nevada, particularly in Nevada, we start seeing these Chinese communities that are growing up, and they're providing different things to the Chinese railroad workers along the way. So in the 1850s, the Chinese migrant workers were looked on favorably because they provided an essential tax revenue that helped fill the fiscal gap in California that was filling at the time. At one point, Chinese men represented nearly a quarter of all wage-earning workers in California. However, with the post-Civil War economy in decline in the 1870s, public opinion towards the Chinese turned hostile. Worker and nativist parties blamed the Chinese, who they refer to as coolies, for depressing wage levels. Violence towards Chinese increased. There's research out there that shows that in California alone, during the 1860s and 70s, there was over 150 violent acts against Chinese and Chinese communities. On May 6, 1882, President Charles Arthur signed the Chinese Exclusion Act, prohibiting all immigration of Chinese laborers. It built on the 1875 Page Act, which bans Chinese women from immigrating. The act was initially intended to last for 10 years, but was renewed in 1892 and made permanent in 1902. It was finally repealed in 1943 by the Magnuson Act as a concession for the Chinese becoming allies against the Japanese during World War II. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 and the Nationality Act of 1965 abolished racial and ethnic barriers to immigration, although we know that's under attack as well. So what we start seeing, what I wanted to show by this line graph is that we can see the change in population of Chinese, and here we have 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and you start seeing Chinese populations decline because of that. And but what we also see, looking at population pyramids for the town of Terrace, is you can see the Chinese men are aging. There's not a big influx of younger workers. These railroad workers are aging without any replacement. And so looking at the census data is one of the things that we're continuing to explore, and to see how the Chinese were adapting to work along the railroad. Because what's interesting is once the Golden Spike had been driven into the ground, the Chinese railroad workers were largely out of work. A lot of them could stay behind as we saw, as maintenance crews on the railroad, but if there were 6,000 of those people during the final construction phase, where did they all go to? So trying to track them in census data and other records is very interesting. A lot of them went back to the gold mines of Nevada and California. Some of them went up into Montana to work on the railroads up in Montana. We have one Chinese worker in this little town of Battle Creek up in just north of Preston that worked on the Utah Northern Railroad in the 1870s and 80s. Chris Merritt shows a number of Chinese that immigrated up into Montana and the other northern railroad lines. A lot of them emigrated up into Canada, but I think a lot of them also went back to China. And trying to understand that reverse immigration is an important part of this story. That because of those records have been lost or have not been found. That's another part of the research. Yes.
So were the Chinese workers who came able to have anyone come, any females come to the general area? You're only not giving the census for the males here. Were there any Chinese women who came, and would they marry a Caucasian woman if they had a chance? The Japanese were very specific about staying in their...
Yeah, there's a couple records of I think from the gold fields where Chinese men were marrying Caucasian women, but it was very rare. Chinese women were brought to the United States. It was expensive. Usually, most of them lived in some of the California towns, such as San Francisco, Los Angeles. So that's one part of the record that isn't well understood is the Chinese women in America, and there's a couple researchers at Stanford that are trying to get a better understanding of who the women are, because when they show up in these remote areas, it's always assumed that they're prostitutes, and that might not always have been the case. But in the census data, they do show up. We have a woman in the census data from Terrace in 1880. So they're there. They're just they're a small part of the community, and their impact on the community is not understood. But yeah, that's a good question, and that's something that's being looked at by researchers is to trying to understand Chinese women in America. Yes.
This is just going back a little bit to when we were talking about the Chinese Exclusion Act. So in Utah, especially starting in about 1890, there was an increase in Chinese lynchings here in the state, especially in the Ogden area. Do you know anything about that, or any research behind that?
No, I haven't really done that. I don't know. I know there was in Corinne. There was a lot of violence in Corinne. There's the famous Chinese massacre up in Rock Springs that occurred in the 1880s. So there was a lot of violence. And I apologize, just that I haven't looked into that very well. So we got another grant to continue work out there from state history that will begin in the spring, but also other research that we're continuing to work with includes geophysical surveys of some of the dugouts, and this is what our data from ground penetrating radar looks like. This is one of the dugouts. We have this whitish area there that shows that we think is a prepared floor. So these dugouts may not have been completely destroyed by looters. It'll start helping us start thinking about research questions that we can address with excavations. We're also so Molly Cannon's been doing all the geophysical work on this. She's also been looking at some of the cemeteries out there. There's a big cemetery at Terrace, and one a little bit further east called Old Terrace. She's identified a number of burials outside of the fenced area. I doubt any of those are Chinese, but it's also an important part of the story out there. One of the things that I'm doing is looking at the isotopes of the pig and cattle bones to see if they were raising this stock locally or if it was being imported. That would help us understand a little bit better about the economy of the area and how people are becoming more settled in the town of Terrace. And I mentioned earlier, we're looking at we're trying to understand the technology behind some of the ceramics, and particularly their glazes. The glazes have signatures that's related to where they are manufactured, the geology of those areas. So we're trying to understand if these things came from one central point or if they were coming from a number of different places in Guangdong province or in other places in China. Mike Polk has been looking at trying to understand how the structures, the formal housing that the Central Pacific Railroad was being made. That's a line drawing, architectural drawing of a bunkhouse from the Civil War. He thinks that a lot of these Civil War bunkhouses might have been repurposed by the railroad. So that's ongoing, and Chris Merritt is continuing his historic research of documents and to try and find more records of the Chinese and their experience. So what he's mostly been going through is a lot of the newspaper articles to see what we can find about their life over here.
Previous one. What's that? On the left-hand side.
That's it's a XRF. It's an XRF gun, so it's looking at X-ray fluorescence, so actually looking at the chemical signatures of the ceramics. So that's a little teacup that's sitting up there. We can zap that with the little Bruker machine, and it gives us a spectrum of the different chemicals that are in the glazes, and then we can start looking at the geology and see how that might be reflected in the different ones that are coming out of here. And one of the things that we've been working with, Dan Murphy's a ceramicist up at USU, and he does a lot of work in China with Chinese ceramicists, and also trying to replicate the glazes as well too. What's in the glazes, because there's a lot of variability in the colors. And the colors are what we call wintergreen. If that's is that reflected in where they're being manufactured? Because all of these things are being mass produced, at least later on, and you can see that in a lot of the designs on here. Some of the later designs become a lot more indistinguishable because these are all being hand drawn. But I think as the production increased, you started just getting little silly lines. And there's a number of them that we have that you can see that it's just that, it just digresses as they're trying to make more and more in the market, put more and more of those in the market. So that's kind of some bigger questions about industrialization and back in China that we're trying to get at slowly. So the work we began in 2015, as I said, is an ongoing effort by anthropologists and archaeologists to understand and highlight the significance and the efforts of various ethnic and cultural groups, and in this case, the overseas Chinese workers. And the relevance, I think, in today's political climate, not to become political, but it can't be understated as we see more and more immigrant groups are becoming demonized. And so, we kind of continue to repeat these same things in our country and don't seem to learn from them. So formal recognition of the tremendous effort and contribution that Chinese laborers made to the construction of the first transcontinental railroad and the influences had in making the United States an international economic power is finally being achieved and realized. While the significance of the railroad to the economic development of the United States cannot be overlooked, not all the consequences were positive. There was displacement of native groups, extermination of bison, and the impacts that had on the environments, just to name a couple of them. So where historians were largely responsible for the telling of the story, archaeologists and anthropologists have more recently begun to make serious contributions to this study. And I think this is apparent by the Chinese Railroad Workers of America project at Stanford University. And I don't know if anybody has visited their website, but it's got a lot of great resources on it that can be downloaded, a lot of reports and various things. And we hope, the work I've been doing out and my colleagues have been doing out in Box Elder County will contribute to that. So, thank you.
Protected if you did not collect?
Excuse me?
How are the artifacts being protected if you did not collect?
Oh, there's probably tens of thousands of them out there.
That's right.
Tens of thousands.
So are they just there for users today?
Yeah, and that's one of the unfortunate things about it is, it's a remote area. The BLM doesn't have the resources to maintain it, and people, there's been looters out there on 3 different occasions that I've been there. I've called Box Elder County Sheriff's Department. They never show up. They ask me why I don't approach people, and I don't, because every time I've seen one of these guys, they've had guns on them, and I assume everybody is packing in Utah, so I'm not going to put my life at risk. So yeah, it's really unfortunate. And probably the biggest impact was during the 1960s when bottle collecting was at its height. People were going out there looking for bottles. They were digging these things up and looting the bottles. Today it might be a little bit more sporadic, but The BLM just last year, I don't know, they probably, I think, spent $75,000 on erecting new interpretive signs out there. Every one of them has been shot up within 6 months. So it's, I don't know how to explain it. One of the things that we're trying to do, and Molly's more focused on that, is to do a lot more public outreaching, especially up in these communities. And I think it's a good opportunity now with the 150th anniversary coming up to start talking to them and having them understand that this is a shared heritage that they have. And but it's everybody who's lived in the West knows that there's a lot of animosity and friction between landowners, ranchers, and the federal government, and particularly BLM. So it's kind of tough. But
Owns the land.
the BLM, the BLM, the whole Central Pacific Railroad grade, with the exception of what's at Promotora, is Bureau of Land Management. Yeah. And there has been, Rob Bishop, Congressman Rob Bishop has introduced a bill to bring the entire grade within the Park Service, National Park Service, and make it a National Historic Site. I don't know how far that's going to go, but that's, I don't know if that would give it any more protection, because the Park Service doesn't have any money either. So it's, I think, one of the things that, it's just trying to educate people about that, and,
So just one question, is this area accessible to people who aren't familiar? Because then we can climb fences and break fences.
well, none of this is protected. You drive, the railroad grade is like I said, is a byway. You can drive on it. It's maintained. Parts of where the grade goes across some of the trestles and culverts that have been collapsed, they've built the bypass around it, but you can drive the entire 90 miles of it, and you get out, and they've got signs right there. You can see where Terrace is. You walk out and you can see all those remains. Bovine, any of those places, they'll have signs on them, so you can see. You can see the big cuts that are there. There's several of them. We just finished a survey. We got a contract from the Bureau of Land Management to survey all the features out there. So the last couple months we've been photographing and recording all the terraces, all the trestles, on all the culverts out there, and so that'll go into a database to try and understand how we can better protect them. But they're being eroded. None of the original ones that were put down in 1869 exist anymore. They were all replaced in the 1870s and 1880s, but they're still some of the, not the original, but they're part of the Central Pacific Railroad grade that was there. And they're fascinating structures to look at. So those are there, and they're trying to find ways to better protect them. But it's it's all open country out there. And one thing, oops, I just turned this off. I wanted to show is, if I can find it here. Molly just got a grant from the state of Utah to create a traveling exhibit on the Chinese railroad workers, and these are, if it opens up, I'll show you what they look like. They're really large exhibits. Just gonna let me open it. That could be available to schools. I don't exactly know what her schedule is. She's got some of them scheduled out across the state, but they could be available to. Oh, here they are. So these are, and they're big. They're huge. And if anybody wants to maybe contact her on these to have them displayed anywhere, I can give you her her email address. I know they're scheduled for different places around the state, but they're really pretty spectacular. She also has these cutouts of the workers.
Is there any special museum to show all of these things?
Molly's at the Anthropology Museum. There is a small display of artifacts that came off of some of the Chinese communities. But this is the main one that she's got going on right now. That if anybody wants to contact her on those. And she's also, I think along with this exhibit are going to be some artifacts as well too. She's got some barrels that would have been, kind of reconstructed barrels that they would have transported materials in that have a lot of these different artifacts in them that people can visit and stuff. So.
These are like big posters.
Yeah, they're huge standalone. Yeah, I think some of those are probably 7 feet long, I think, and they're at least 5, 6, 7 feet tall. So yeah, so they need a big space. They would probably take up a good part of this room.
I had one about the artifacts that you were finding. Why, if looters can just take them and there's nobody that's really holding them to be accountable, how come you and your team can't just before the bad guys?
Well, yeah, I know. Well, it's quite frustrating. One of the reasons we can't collect them is because there's no place in the state of Utah to curate historic artifacts. The museum, still a little ways away from here, they will not accept historic artifacts. They only take prehistoric materials. So there's no place to formally curate some. So as part of the permitting process that we would have to go through to get to allow us to do any work out there on federal land, we would have to find a curation facility, and also that costs a lot of money to curate the material. So those are kind of the biggest reasons. If we worked on private land, we wouldn't have to deal with that. I could curate it in my backyard if I wanted to. But on public lands, we can't collect them. There's no place to curate them, and we haven't had the funding to do it. All this, the budget that we got to do the original survey probably only covered half of our expenses. The rest of it just kind of came out of my pocket to pay. But we're hoping, we've got a Go Fund It proposal in, hopefully to help us do more work out there. People with the 150th anniversary, there's a lot more probably interest in doing that, and there might be more funds coming along. I know the State History has purchased property to the west that if they ever can get funding will be for a curation facility, but that's a few years down the road. But they bought the property, so that's a plus. So that's the biggest thing is where do we store these things. But yeah, it's really frustrating to go out there and see that stuff being destroyed like it is, But collectors, when you talk to them about it, they'll say, "Oh, you guys just put it in a basement anyway, then nobody gets to look at it, so we're actually saving it by taking it home and whatever they do with it." So.
I have a question.
Yes.
I was wondering, earlier in your presentation, you talked about party, natives, and things like that.
Right.
So why was it so different over here on the West Coast, where the Irishmen were being paid more than the Chinese?
I think mostly because they were willing to be out here, and they were white guys, and and they were part of the dominant culture, and they demanded more and got more. They, we look at all the census data, and it's pretty remarkable how consistent it is. You had like 17 to 22 Chinese workers and 1 or 2 foremen, and almost, I would say 95% of them are Irish, which is, maybe they were more skilled at organizing people and organized labor. They might have worked on, I think a lot of them probably worked on the Union Pacific Railroad. But yeah, I think that's just part of the. Even though the Irish were being discriminated in other parts of the country, they came out here and they were able to make a better living for.
It could also be the fact that the people who came to Utah were Northern European or British. Therefore, being Irish, even though there's some conflict on that piece of geography, they're at least seen as part of that island. Therefore, they may have had a better chance here than they would have, say, in New York.
Sure, yeah. I think that could be true. And these people are living on these isolated section stations. I mean, they're. You look at where these things are, and there's 25 people, 25 men living, in these little section camps. So I think they weren't necessarily being pressured from those other larger cultural norms that were going on in the rest of the country. So, but yeah, that's a good issue and a good question.
I have a question about the amount of immigrants who stayed here, who relocated to other places, and how many moved back to China. Do you know much about that?
No, we really don't have a good understanding of that. And I don't know if some of those records were destroyed in the earthquake, because they're all coming and going out of San Francisco, the San Francisco ports. So I'm guessing a lot of those records, those ship logs, have probably been lost. But I know that the folks at Stanford are trying to look at that. So yeah, and also another part of that question is that when Chinese men died, they made an agreement with the Central Pacific Railroad to have their bones returned, and we're guessing that probably very few of them did. But supposedly Crocker made a deal with them and said that he would pay the expenses, and there are a few records of them going back, but very few of them actually made it back to China. So that reverse migration is not very well understood. And I think a lot of the records probably might have been destroyed during the Cultural Revolution as well. In the 1960s, there's a lot of burning of records at that time. Because I think one of the interesting things is that for a long time, the Chinese diaspora was not looked on very favorably by the Chinese government. If you left the country, you were abandoning us, because there was a lot of concern in China at the time that China would be depopulated of men because they were being recruited, and they weren't only being recruited to the United States. They were going to Cuba. There was a huge Chinese worker population in Cuba, in Singapore, and up into Alaska. So the Chinese men out of Guangdong province were going to a lot of different places around the country. They were going to Java, Indonesia, all these different places to work. So there was a real concern that China would be depopulated of working age men. So when people left, it was nobody looked on it very, very favorably. So I think that kind of just goes into the larger dialogue of why we don't understand it better than we do. Because it wasn't 150 years ago isn't that long ago, but a lot's been lost in that time period.
Do you know, I'm sure you do, what the protocol was when Chinese workers died along the building of the railroad? And I know there's statistics that it's like one for every like something of a mile or something, so we know there were a lot of deaths. How did they handle all those bodies? Was there some sort of protocol they followed, or did they just give us?
Yeah, we don't know. That's something we don't know. We don't even, so those numbers are at best really guesses, because there's not really good records. And again, some of those records might have been destroyed. They were part of the Central Pacific Railroad records that Stanford kept that were lost. So there might have been better records of injuries and deaths and stuff like that. But what's been looked at so far, there really isn't a lot of record keeping that went on. There are a couple cemeteries. There's a cemetery in Winnemucca that probably would have had that I think had some of those Chinese workers were buried there. There's some isolated graves up in some of the gold mines up in Montana, workers that died. But yeah, that's something that's not very well understood.
And just along the railroad itself, out here in western Utah, there's not mass graves or...
No, we haven't found, there's nothing in the records, and we haven't found anything that would suggest it. But, when we've been surveying, we've been sticking pretty close to the grave. We haven't really expanded out very, very far. That cemetery that's at Terrace there are some markers there, and they're all Euro-American markers. We would guess that if there were Chinese that died, they would be buried someplace else. If they had wooden markers or something like that, they probably deteriorated. Yeah, there's nothing that we found so far. One of the things that we've been trying to find funding for is to have the whole railroad grade map with LiDAR. So then, LiDAR is so you fly a plane over and it sends down a signal, and it creates a digital map of the landscape at a very high resolution, and something like that might help us identify where there's depressions that would be off the grade that might be graves, but so far we haven't been able to find money to support that yet. But yeah, that's one of the things that kind of a fascinating question is, if they died, what happened to them, and just how they took care of themselves. Because I don't know, I work in my backyard and I'm tired, just planting tomatoes and stuff in the summertime and raking leaves and things like that. But I can't imagine, the physical toll that working on that railroad grade, because they were working 6 days a week. They had Sundays off to recuperate, but they were out there in all kinds of weather, under all kinds of conditions. So it was obviously not a very easy life, and how they, I think, the healthcare part of it is important to understand. How were they taking care of themselves without, even though in the 1860s and 1870s, Western healthcare wasn't all that great and formalized anyway, but it's still, if you went into a town, you got to see somebody that sort of could take care of you. But out in this rural area, how would you take care of broken bones, reset broken bones, things like that, and just the everyday wear and tear that went on. So.
The last question.
One of the questions, answer the question a little bit. It was a long time ago I read a novel. I think it's called by the Gate something. It's talking about the Chinese railroad worker working through the Sierra mountain tunnels and about that. And they just buried it at the spot.
Yeah.
That's what.
Yeah, they could be very well buried along the grade somewhere. Yeah, I think I thought there was like 20 that were killed in a big avalanche, a big snow avalanche, and they just probably dug a hole and stuck them in the ground. Yeah. One of the things, and is everybody in here? Are you high school teachers, or I guess what's the high school? Okay, so one of the things that this graphic novel, I think, might be something that high school age kids might do. It's a family that that worked and lived up in Canada, so it's not the Central Pacific Railroad, but it's the same story, and they went and created this graphic novel about their family's history of emigrating and working on the railroad. So that's something that might be to Gold Mountain. So that was what they referred to as the California gold fields. But it's pretty well done. There's also, in the introduction, they have a more detailed history of their family and stuff too, so it's multi-generational. The descendants are still, great-great-grandkids are still here and living in. David Wong. And this is maybe not for high school kids, but this is just a collection of papers about the Chinese on the American frontier that might be of interest. And they're papers that were printed in other journals and stuff that they just collected in this volume. Chinese on the American frontier.
It's edited by
Arif Derlich.
So we're going to take a short 5-10 minute break. You're welcome to stretch your legs and kind of check out some of the artifacts here. We're just ask questions informally, and then we're going to reconvene, talk about how we can incorporate this into work that you do with your students. So we'll break for 5 to 10 and then come back. We want to give a thank you to Dr. Cannon.
Thanks very much.
some gift from Confucius Institute.
Oh, wow.
T-shirts for the whole family.
Oh, well, thanks very much.
And some special things from the...
Oh, this is great.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks.
So